Great. So I have a little bit of presentation, and then I'm going to read some excerpts of writing, and then there will be some time for a conversation. That's hopefully about 20 minutes at the end for conversation, maybe a little more. Share screen. Oh, but do I have the thing up? All right. All right. So I'm going to be talking about my own research today, and both research in an academic sense, but also research what I do with my art, and they're pretty inseparable. I tend to think of my art as, whoops. I tend to think of my art as the laboratory for my writing. So I do a number of artistic practices with different communities, whether that's producing plays or whether it's House of Larva Drag Cooperative that I'm a co-founder of. And I work with 2 other folks in that, whether it's other kinds of collaborations. That's the laboratory, and then I write about it and reflect on it in my scholarly writing. So this is a presentation on Drag Theopoetics, a term that I've coined to discuss my work. And I'll define that, and I'll also talk about the origin of that line of inquiry of why I'm calling a body of work Drag Theopoetics. Here we have a number of different drag icons, old and new, and this quote from the now canceled RuPaul sitcom dramedy, I guess, AJ and the Queen. And this quote is, "Everybody's in drag, which is fine as long as they know it." And then we have a slightly older text, though I'm sure RuPaul would make a joke about how she's ancient because that's her humor. But the joke aside, this is from Euripides Bacchae, possibly one of the oldest representations of drag in literature and theater. "Many are the shapes the gods will take, many the surprises they perform." So these are kind of our entry quotes into this world of drag theopoetics. So the inspiration for diving into this work, besides the fact that I perform in drag, is the use of drag in a lot of contemporary New Age language, and specifically New Age spirituality and its co-optation of the language of drag. So Ram Dass, who died recently, has this quote, "Treat everyone you meet like God in drag." Again, treat everyone you meet like God in drag. Deepak Chopra on Twitter has posted, "We are all God in drag." Jay Michelson, who's a scholar and writing in theology, is also very much in conversation with some of these folks and has written numerous pieces about drag. And here's just a taste. "God donning the drag of us" is a really beautiful phrase, I find. And then lastly, well, not lastly, additionally, Daniel Ladinsky, the quote unquote translator of Hafiz. It's really interpretations. It's not close to literal. But Daniel Ladinsky writes, "You are the sun in drag, sweetheart, oh sweetheart, you are God in drag." And then unique out of all 5 of these people is RuPaul, who is actually a professional drag performer. And RuPaul, who has written a number of sort of self-help and spiritual guide books, writes, "Drag reveals this idea that you are not your body. You are an extension of the power that created the whole universe. That's drag. We are all God in drag." RuPaul continues in his book Guru, which always makes me laugh. You've heard me say, you're born naked and the rest is drag. In truth, you are not your clothes, you are not your profession, you are not your religion. You are an extension of the consciousness that guides the universe, for which there is no name because it cannot be defined. That's why all the superficial things you list as your identity are in reality your drag. Years ago, when I heard someone say, we are all God in drag, I know it to be the truth at my core. So I have a question to all these folks, namely, these poets, cultural thinkers, and theologians, all these folks use drag as a metaphor for God in the world. So it's a metaphor, a symbol. But how might we take these comments in a more systematic way, in a more concrete way as well? How does actual drag theologize, like the performance, the culture, and it's multiplicitous and all of those things, but how does drag, an art form, actually theologize? How might we examine drag not only as a metaphor for the human divine relationship, but as a means to understand, commune with, and transform ourselves and God? So as I said earlier, RuPaul is unique in being both a practitioner of drag and a thinker who explicitly links God and drag. Right here is a picture of Kevin Aviance, who is a drag performer from the club scene in New York, and whose work I've written about as well. But in particular, Aviance is known for really intense dance and gestures and voguing. And these gestures are like such a huge part of their work. And so when we're thinking about the actual practice of drag, I thought it would be helpful to have someone who not only dons the drag articles, but whose very movements and body kind of exaggerate. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. By putting the practice of drag in conversation with reflection on that practice, we engage praxes of drag theopoetics. So just a refresher from a couple weeks ago about what theopoetics is. It's an interdisciplinary approach to theology, myth, art, embodiment, etc. And God is revealed, that says God is revealed through poesis, or making, and poetics, not necessarily logos, the word, or words. Theology or piety cannot give any account of faith without a continual rehearsal of visionary representations, dramatic vehicles, and affectional language, writes Amos Wilder in his book Theopoetic. Yeah, I'm not gonna go too far into these definitions, because I'll explain more specifically what I mean with a drag theopoetic. So a particular beginning to poke at what is a drag theopoetics. I write, none of these are the same as each other, and none of them fully contradict each other. They are all approaching what a drag theopoetics is. A drag theopoetics is a theopoetics of a professional or amateur crossdresser that implicates God as crossdresser. A performance that explores questions of self, gender, identity, divinity, and ethics. One sec. Encountering the divine while performing in drag, or being in the audience at a drag performance, or watching drag on television or film. Cross-identificatory practices with other genders or gender performances in liturgy, scripture, poetry, and song. 5, myths of divinity becoming gendered deities, of deities becoming gendered mortals, of mortals donning sacred garments to encounter divine presence, of bodies in metamorphosis. And quoting from a different piece of my own writing, it means theater, it means lip syncing to Ave Maria, it means gesture and somatics and camp. It means drag kings, drag queens, non-binary dragsters, drag ogres, drag gods, drag monsters, flitting between the centers and the peripheries of queer community as a class of priests and wonder workers, It means the conscious performance of another gender or a heightened version of one's own gender as a mean to understand divinity, the world, self, and other selves. It's these last two definitions, the myths of divinity becoming gender deities and the last listy one, that will be the focus of today's presentation. So I'm going to look at two examples of myth making and drag. So how does drag up in myth making? I'll read two different excerpts, and then we'll have some conversation. So this is more on the scholarly side, and then there will be later a little more on the artistic side. So I'm looking at two examples of mythopia from world, theater, religion, etc. The first that we'll be looking at is Euripides' Bacchae, which was performed after he died in 405 BCE. It won the Dionysia Festival Award in Athens, and is one of his most famous plays. In it, it depicts the god Dionysus, who is the god of the vine, the god of non-Greeks, the god of women and slaves and foreigners, and also eventually the god of theater. In the play, the Bacchae, Dionysus is both the bookends of it, the introduces the subject of the play, but he's also a main character in it. So he comes down as this god, and he has this opening monologue where he's like, I'm originally from this place, Thebes. My mortal mother is here, but my father is the god Zeus. And basically in this monologue, he describes putting on a human body so that he can interact with these people in Thebes. And the people of Thebes have wronged Dionysus. In particular, the current king of Thebes has, Cadmus, has given power to his grandson, Pentheus. And Pentheus, who is the cousin of Dionysus, outlaws the worship of Dionysus. He doesn't know he's related to this god, but he knows there's this foreign god that a lot of people are worshiping. And as this authoritarian, very masculine, very angry, very repressed leader, he says, anyone who worships this god will be killed or thrown into jail. So this is the context into which the god Dionysus throws himself. He's very much aware that he is an enemy of the state currently, and he's gonna use that to overthrow Pentheus. So stop sharing for a bit. So a little bit just thinking of drag, how I'm using drag in a little more of a full way. Drag is a study of the self, and it's analogous to mystical inquiry. Like the naturalist mystic who studies symbols of the natural to know herself, her cosmos, and God, drag performers study gender, sexuality, and a variety of identity signifiers to create personae. In the process, learning about themselves, and sometimes even helping audience members learn a bit about themselves. Drag disorients gender presumptions with the potential to disorient all identitarian presumptions. Drag is an art of creating selves. It could be said that acting in general is an art of creating selves, and I would not disagree. Indeed, it will become clear how much what I refer to drag is indebted to acting and dance and other performance practices. However, and quote, I am this person, I am not this person paradox is at the heart of the art of drag, of its humor, irony, and radicalism, in a way that is not typically the case in acting, especially outside avant-garde acting, where the audience rarely is supposed to be hyper-conscious or even conscious of the illusion of performance. In drag, artificiality is the point. In acting, it is typically discouraged, again, with the exception of some avant-garde theater. With drag, we might think of Philip Corr's definition of camp as, quote, a lie which tells the truth, quote. Drag tells the truth by presenting falsehoods, by performing exaggerations, by putting the engendering of gender under the proverbial microscope, prodding it with a sequin glove. In the drag gender lab, I wonder what lies reveal God. So we'll begin with the Bacchae. What lies reveal God in the Bacchae? What fictions? And I always am using lies in quotes. Fiction for me is not the opposite of real, as hopefully will come through in the writing. In a scene of Euripides' Bacchae, the tyrant Pentheus has unknowingly captured Dionysus, who is disguised as a foreign stranger, this cult leader of the Dionysian mysteries. Pentheus is interrogating Dionysus' stranger, but the latter keeps confounding Pentheus with his answers. In the most dramatic moment of this interchange, the god disguised as human asks Pentheus, "How do you live? What are you doing? Who are you?" Pentheus answers with some basic identificatory information, but his answer evades the profundity of the god's interpolation. In his search for knowledge, a search not originating from curiosity, but from a desire for complete control, Pentheus approaches the divine, but the divine is the stranger, and it is the stranger who replies to your question with another one, a question that alienates. Suddenly, you doubt who you are. Are you the stranger? Dorothy Sola, in her work on the erotic and the mystical, asks of lovers, quote, "Do they not always have to love more than what they know of each other and what is knowable?" Quote. For Sola, life comprises what is grasped of the lover and what is ungraspable. The pain pleasure of the grasped, ungraspable lover is at the core of the mystical relationship with God. She writes, a religious tradition answers this question by referring to the amalgam of mystery, both frightening and fascinating. Only the far near one can stay near. Only the one never wholly known can be known. Deprivation, separation, and ecstasy's bitterness keep its sweetness alive. The experience of integration, for instance, the integration of bodies in the act of sexual communion, cannot occur without a state of disintegration. The eroticism of the interaction between Pentheus and his captive surfaces in a confrontation over knowledge. Pentheus seeks knowledge of the Dionysian mysteries. His initial disgust at the Bacchic women and their effeminate leader, the stranger, belies his desire to know what the stranger knows, to know the god. The stranger imply Pentheus must know himself. Each must know a certain perspective. Where does each stand? What does each see? What does each want? Pentheus proves unable to honor the ground on which he stands, his family and his foundation by divine ordination. He is unable to see beyond his own designs. He suppresses what he wants as a tactic to remain in charge. In saying he does not know Dionysus, even as he tugs on the god's hair and mocks his girlish lips. In presuming his own omnipotence, rather than analyzing how the event of Pentheus has manifested and by whom, Pentheus has signed away his fate. By standing his authoritarian ground, his gnosis must match his arrogance. Pentheus, in the tragedy, will be ripped to pieces, but in that moment, he will experience the ecstasis of knowing God. If we think of this encounter between Pentheus and Dionysus from a pantheist perspective, and I am thinking a lot of the work that will be discussed today from a more pantheistic perspective, we have two incarnations of the same divinity interrogating one another. What the pantheist persona does not understand is that love is not simply complete concord, since there is also the other's strangeness and one's being frightened by the stranger. It is the strangeness, that aspect of utter difference, the unintelligibility of the other, that makes the attraction possible. Relationships, erotic, cosmic, mystical, generative, are impossible without difference. Again, relationships, erotic, cosmic, mystical, generative, are impossible without difference. But relationships are contingent, relationship is a contingent difference. So it's not that there's a complete difference ontically, categorically, statically. They're different, but contingent on one each other, touching with each other. Differences are a matter of perspective, and perspective is determined by constitutive relationships. The emergence of selves, theologian Mary Jane Rubenstein defines as pancarnation, or, quote, divinity's inability not to express itself in and as the endless, stubbornly untotalized run of all things. She continues, this is not, of course, to say that everything is divine to every perceiving agent. Far less is it to say that everything is the same. Rather, it is to acknowledge that what looks like an inert rock from one perspective is a sacred ancestor from another. That the catfish one person serves for dinner could be kin to her partner and a great creative being to both of them, and that what looks in one light like the image of God is in another peccary, and in another still the billion-year product of bacterial collaboration, quote. If the cosmos is cosmoi, a plurality of interrelated beings, agents of their own stories, then any given self fluctuates between being the center of their story, a supporting character, or the background. Each of these depends on perspective. This perspectival pancarnation is, quote, different from relativism if the latter asserts that there are many ways to interpret the same world. The former would assert that worlds, and therefore divinities, take shape differently depending on the points of view that intra-agentially construct them. Agents form communities, the body, the self, the world. But Rubenstein reminds us that the constituent agents are never only those formations. What does it mean then when we presume to have a self who is impenetrable and unchangeable, whose perspective is singular and objective? For one, we get tyranny and violence. But more specifically, we get a conception of the self which cuts us off from new sight. And new sight cuts us off from new becoming, from change, from reintegration into forms of life. However, without the emergence of selves, the pleasure of formation, attraction, and erotic animacy cannot exist. The animating power of attraction lives through distinction. What is offensive in the presumption of the self is not the self, but in fact the presumption, more specifically, the presumption of a naturalized prediscursive self. The answer to the presumed self is not self-destruction, but the performance of self. Performance is a process. It involves articulations and gestures rehearsed into a body. Performance takes time and the denial of certain other interactions or behaviors until a persona is born, able to act and speak from their unique perspective. That unique perspective allows for new pleasure and new encounters. But a performance is importantly ephemeral. It is not meant to last forever. An actor who can only do one single character, not even allowing for slight variations, is a dull actor indeed. We must allow for change in ourselves. We must confront Pentheus and interrogate him. But we must allow also for change in the divine. For divinity is omnipersonal, taking shape as every kind of person, depending on the circumstance. Pentheus asks his questions either rhetorically, assuming he knows the answer, or with utility. The stranger is not a person in their own right, but a source of knowledge to use and exploit. Pentheus does not ask the stranger how the stranger has come to be, a fatal mistake, for if Pentheus had asked Dionysus, how do you live, what are you doing, who are you, perhaps the god's divinity could have been revealed. Were Pentheus to acknowledge the stranger as divine, he would, to paraphrase Rubenstein, profess a certain humility and awe in relation to Dionysus, and thereby mark the stranger as worthy of reverence. Perhaps Pentheus is acknowledging the stranger's divinity, in acknowledging the stranger's divinity would have saved his own life, but perhaps not. We are not guaranteed to be loved by every god. But in ignoring the other's divinity by presuming my own superiority, I assure that the current particular articulation of myself is an strained, contentious, and harmful relationship with the co-creative universe that lives through give and take. Rubinstein concludes in her book that those events we call gods would be discovered, sustained, killed off, resurrected, shared, transmogrified, and multiplied between and among temporary clusters of relation, as it has in those queerly intraspecies assemblages of Arcadia, Nazareth, Uluru, the Amazon, Turtle Island, Gaia, and untold multitudes of symbiotic ecosystems. Divinity, thus construed, would show up in unforeseen crossings and alliances. It would frighten and delight us, save and ruin us with visions of the worlds and gods we've made and glimpses of those that might yet emerge from our multi-species mist. Embrace the many, she articulates in her Rubinsteinian way, and I will. And I do this by seeing who is there to embrace, who already embraces me, by acknowledging how I come to be. That as I write this, I am a community of agents performing, for the moment, a self. So I'll pause here before the second excerpt to see if there are any questions. I don't explicitly talk about drag in that excerpt, but so much as I talk about the difference between presumption and performance. So I'm curious if there are any questions right now.
Yeah, hi Max. Yeah, that's just great. There's so much there. I'm going to have to get a copy of that and dissect it. My question is, and just go ahead and defer this, push it aside if you need to. But what came up for me, and I don't have any background in acting. So if someone's going to be doing, gender stuff, sensuality on stage, is there a certain method that they need to get into that state or sense of, is there a certain way of them getting into that role, I guess?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think a lot of the acting training that I do is informed by the work of Eugenio Barba and theater anthropology, which is really focusing on the difference between how much energy we put into our gestures and actions on a day-to-day base and rethinking how we do that in a performance space. So I might wave to you and not think about it in my day-to-day space, but in a performance space, I might take 10 seconds, which is a lot more energy to wave. So to a certain extent, to your question, it's accessing some of those gestures, those physical movements that might be signed or recognized as relating to sexuality or sensuality. I would say it's, if you're doing a healthy job in a theater space, you're not like actually doing that on stage, but you're looking at some of those gestures that are recognizable as relating to sexuality and sensuality, and you're putting a different amount of energy onto it, different emphases, thinking about balance in different ways. That said, when it's dealing with really personal stuff like sensuality, sexuality, you should have someone who knows how to coach that in a professional way in a theater space. Similarly with gender stuff, is you need to be aware of the genders in the room, of who's in the room, what people's relationships to their self, their sex, their gender are, to some extent, if you're doing work that, well, I would say definitely if you're doing work that is focusing on gender and performance. Does that answer, Don?
Yeah, and then just one little thing on that would, like, for instance, a person, they pay attention to, in real life, in a safe space or something, but paying attention to their movements, and that somehow, if they really get attuned to that, that would transfer to stage.
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I encourage in a rehearsal process is paying attention to day-to-day actions, and then
Okay.
Yeah, great. So I'll open up to more questions in a little bit. I'll bring in this sort of other source of mythology that I'm working on, or working with. So the first was the Bacchae, and then the second is Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, and particularly Lurianic Kabbalah. So Kabbalah from the late 1500s, early 1600s. And this is my example of a second mythopoetic exploration of drag. And that is myth-making exploration of drag. Kabbalah is a theosophical system. Theosophy, explains foundational scholar of Jewish mysticism Gershom Scholem, postulates a kind of divine emanation whereby God, abandoning his self-contained repose, awakens to mysterious life. Further, it maintains that the mysteries of creation reflect the pulsation of this divine life. In Kabbalah, God doesn't just create the world, God becomes the world. God does this in large part by becoming the 10 Sephirot: Keter, crown; Chochmah, wisdom; Bina, understanding; Chesed, loving kindness; Gevurah, or Din, might or justice; Tiferet, beauty; Netzach, victory; Hod, glory; Yesod, foundation; and Malkut, the realm, who is also the Shekhinah, the feminine divine presence. So in the beginning of this myth, this story, this cosmic tragedy, is the Ein Sof, the limitless, who, according to parts of the Zohar, has neither qualities nor attributes. When the limitless acts in the world, it has also certain attributes which in turn represent certain aspects of the divine nature. There are so many stages of the divine being and divine manifestation of his divine life. The Sephirot are 10 foundational attributes of God, which are at the same time 10 stages through which the divine life pulsates back and forth. There are various phases in the manifestation of the divinity which proceed from and succeed each other. The Sephirot are assigned to parts of God's body in the macro level as realms, and in the micro level in our own body parts. They are also assigned personalities. Indeed, the Sephirot are personalities and are often characters who manifest behaviors and activities while also existing within characters, human or angelic, plant or animal. The Sephirot are also gendered. The emanation of these personalities is as a process which takes place in God, which at the same time enables man to perceive God. That is to say, the Sephirot are perspectives through which God sees and through which God is seen. According to the Zohar, Sholem explains, divine being cannot be expressed. All that can be expressed are God's symbols. The relation between Ein Sof and its mystical qualities, the Sephirot, is comparable to that between the soul and the body, but with the difference that the human body and soul differ in nature, one being material and the other spiritual, while in the organic whole of God, all spheres are substantially the same. The dualism of soul and body imperfectly corresponds to the Ein Sof and the Sephirot. They are not separate substances. Rather, they are containers of God and they are contained. Rather, they are the containers of God and they are the contained, depending on the perspective. The garments of the divinity, but also the beams of light which sends it out. In Kabbalah, theistic and pantheistic trends have frequently contended for mastery. If God is putting on the drag of 10 differentially gendered persons, the drag and the performer are the same substance, just in different shapes. The costume and the costumed are both divine. In the highly pantheistic Lurianic Kabbalah, we find a powerful account of the Ein Sof's decision to become the Sephirot, that is the world. According to Chaim Vital, Rabbi Isaac Luria's student, the Ein Sof is described as a divine light. Before the emanation of any of the emanated entities, the divine light completely suffused all of existence, and there was no free space, no empty vacuum whatsoever. Rather, everything was filled with the undifferentiated light of Ein Sof. There was neither beginning nor end, but everything consisted of this one simple, undifferentiated light, Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is similar to other mystical ideas, for instance, the Gnostic pleroma. In Lurianic mythology, Ein Sof is at once one thing and very complex. This apparently simple, undifferentiated light was actually made up of radically diverse elements, being a mixture of good and evil, light and darkness, and in which the powers of strict judgment were bound up with the powers of compassion. Similarly to creation in the Pleroma, creation in the Ein Sof involves an act of desire. Here, the divine does drag to know its fullness. Vital reports, when Ein Sof determined to create its world and to issue forth the world of emanated entities to bring to light the fullness of his energies, names, and qualities, this being the reason for the creation of the world, Ein Sof then withdrew itself from its centermost point, at the center of its light, and this light retreated from the center to the sides, and thus there remained a free space, an empty vacuum. The withdrawal, or tzimtzum, is the first step of theogony, the birth of gods, in Kabbalah. The Ein Sof makes room so that it can become entities. As scholar Lawrence Fine explains, the fact that the cosmos was completely permeated by divine light made the creation of the various worlds impossible. There simply was no room in which something other than divinity could exist. God wished to benefit something other than itself, and thus conceived the idea of creating worlds by establishing room in which this could take place. God desires to benefit, to help, to give, to love, to know. God is curious, but there is no space, and with no space, no distance, and with no distance, perspective to perceive anything. God puts on forms, or drag, and thus shines light into the space and the light forms. The illumination of Ein Sof clothes itself in garment upon garment. God gets dressed in distinct, sexed, and gendered personalities, all of whom interrelate, loving, hating, fighting, fucking, and perpetuating the world in the process. If the Kabbalist theogony is a myth of drag, then it challenges a clear distinction between the wearer and what is worn. For theologians and drag performers alike who invoke the language of drag, what might we mean when we talk about people as God in drag? For starters, each performance is as authentic as it is false. The lie is the symbol of the truth. We cannot perceive divinity out of drag. And I'll say that last line again. We cannot perceive divinity out of drag. So these are both a lot. I recognize that, but they're the two kind of explorations of two different myths that inform what I mean by a drag theopoetic, the sort of mythic grounding for the more concrete practices that I do in my art and in collaboration. I'd like to open up now to some more questions, comments, and if you want more clarification on anything.
Sorry, because I missed the in-between intercession discussion because I got a phone call. So perhaps maybe it's more clear to other people, but I feel like that last sentence that you repeated, it's quite loaded, and you sort of touched upon leading up to that, but I still feel like it's like dangling, you know, there's something more to say to clarify this idea that you can't perceive divinity out of drag. So it's like there's pieces of that sentence missing for me, which you partly filled in with these ideas from the Kabbalah, which I'm not familiar with. And so like you were talking about, and I'm not sure how to spell the Sephirot or the Ensa, sorry, but I'm curious. So maybe you could explain a little bit more?
Yeah, totally. So I bring the Kabbalah and Euripides together to say they're both examples of a paradox where there is difference and there is sameness. So the part of the tragedy of Pentheus and the Bacchae is that he does not recognize the uniqueness and agency of the stranger. If he did, he would recognize more about himself. He would understand his relationship in the world and his connection to the world. But because he only sees himself as an actor and the stranger as something acted upon, he keeps this complete, total ontic distinction between himself and the stranger, who, as the play reveals, is secretly the god. So what's at stake in both this and the Kabbalah is, how are we different from each other and how are we the same? So in the Kabbalah, the idea is that everything is the same substance. There is no soul. The soul body distinction, even though it uses that language, is ultimately all God. It's all God stuff. The substance is divinity, or the Ein Sof is more accurate. The limitlessness, light. So the mythology is trying to figure out, why is there anything? Why are there people? Why is there world? If everything already was perfect or aligned, why is there any difference? How does that come to be? The Ein Sof makes space, makes nothingness, creates nothingness in order to then create distinction and perspective. Without being able to create the nothingness, the Tzimtzum, there would be nowhere to parse God's self out, or the Ein Sof self. So what happens is the Ein Sof splits itself in order to know the experiences of pleasure, of recognition, of touch, of taste, and all emotions. It's not just pleasures and anger and jealousy and everything that we experience in our day-to-day lives, in our histories. That's a result of the Ein Sof desiring to know itself, and the only way it could know itself was to break itself apart. There was no contrast, no measure in the before Tzimtzum for God to know God's self. Knowledge is fomented in that encounter with another, with a different person or thing. So the drag is necessary because it's the performance of a self. It's a performance of someone utterly other for at least a certain moment of time. That's the important part, that moment of time. Drag allows us to put on a self without being bound to a self, without only being in that Pentheus Dionysus relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because you had talked about how God, the Sephiroth like took up all this space, and this idea of the Ein Sof that's creating space. In my mind, I picture it like a prism, it's sort of something scattering the light, or I have to see it this way to understand. But so when you were referring to this idea of drag as this kind of performing of different possibilities of self or different perspectives of self, and the transitory nature of it, and then this sentence that you cannot perceive divinity out of drag. So out of drag, you're saying like, without having this Ein Sof, you can't perceive divinity. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that divinity, that Ein Sof could not perceive Ein Sof without the container of drag. So if Ein Sof had never separated itself and disguised itself in drag, there would be nothing to see. It wouldn't be able to identify itself.
Right, there would be no separateness.
Yep.
There would be no, yes. It's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, that really speaks to that the problem, or the big question underneath all of this drag theopoetics work is, how is there difference and how is there connection? How are we related to each other through divinity, and how are we also distinct? And for me, an answer is saying, what if we looked at the medium of drag as one place to explore that question? How can drag give us some answers to being both a contingent self, so a self that is in relationship and touching with others, and then also not an eternal self, not a self who is so perfect and unique as to be separate from something that isn't like that. That's a lot. Are there other questions?
One comment. I really like this, Max. This is really wonderful. Because I think it works. It helps highlight some things for those of us that aren't really, well, I can't say I'm not familiar with drag, but for those of us that aren't working within drag or in around that right now, we can apply the same ideas into other areas of our work. And this is a better example to use, actually, so we can reapply it to reconstruct and deconstruct and reform and things like that. Does that make sense? So some wonderful things here. I want to see the text, though. I have to read more.
Yes.
There's a lot of words, and I'm really curious what more is on the page, because I think I only picked up about 10%.
Totally, yeah. But I would say, John, that's exactly the part of the project, is to say, drag. If we're gonna say, if you're gonna have people like Ram Dass or Jay Michelson use drag as a metaphor, I'm saying let's go real deep into that, and how do theologians broadly write about themselves in their work, and do we presume a self or do we perform a self in our work? Do we write in such a way in our work that we aren't paying attention to these big questions of interrelation and separation? So exactly, like, I'm not saying if you are engaging my work or reading my work that you have to do drag, though I recommend it. It's fun, but
if you saw me, I don't think you would agree with that, but
I mean, that's fine. You can just drag for yourself. That's fine too. But the main thing is, how are we presuming a self in our work, whatever that work is, and how might we perform a self? Yeah, are there other questions?
I just want to say there's a real practical application of this. Well, of course, I'll say this because you hear me every time with liturgy, and I think it really would help with theologians to break down some of the barriers of where doctrine comes in and dogma comes in, and getting out of their, taking off a different hat and getting into some new garb, shall we say, to see things in a different light. But I think, literally getting a drag within church services and stuff like that would be quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, I think liturgy would be a big part of this. Stephanie, what were you going to say? Sorry.
No, I agree, John. I think there is, like, as you're talking, Max, I think there's like a really practical, ethical dimension to this work. And I know you don't mention the word ethics. I'm taking ethics right now with Peregrine. Hey, Peregrine. And there's a lot of, themes of reading myths that tackle, wrestling with the stranger and encountering the stranger, and how we respond to stranger and relate to stranger, and see that doubling, like see ourselves through being in relationship with someone different across difference, and human development through history, but also individual history in that way. And I think right now I'm thinking about, as a sex educator, I oftentimes, when people would do like role reversal and playing with gender and who's the initiator or dominant person and who is the submissive person, a lot of that is really about building empathy and emotional intimacy, is being able to like take off what is you think is your default self and put yourself in the other person's skin, and play their role and relate to someone through that role. And it can be completely transformative in an interpersonal, like intimate context. But I think that's also true on a community level. And of course, how that's played out in an erotic way changes, but the way we play together still, even if there isn't that sexual component, can also shift things dramatically. And yeah, I'm really curious about like what John was kind of getting at. I was like, what kind of practically, what could that look like in a community that maybe isn't interested in doing drag explicitly, but maybe some of the exercises that you do, Max, like break that down.
And I would say that liturgies already do that, and scripture does that, and readings do that. One example that I turn to a lot is the use of the Song of Songs, for instance. Reading the Song of Songs in Orthodox Hasidic Jewish community, where it's all, in that particular context, it's men reciting it either around Passover or around the Sabbath. And when you're looking at the actual Hebrew, there's no titles. It's not separated section to section title, the bridegroom, the bride, the man, the woman. It's all just the text. And you have to know, basically, through clues within the text, when there's a gender switch, when there's a role switch, when it's plural, when it's singular. Now, if you're in a group of all men singing this out loud, and both the performer and the listener, not everyone's going to necessarily know which is the right cue to switch between the genders that are speaking. It blurs those lines. So if I'm a man and I'm reciting, my beloved is all right, I don't have the Song of Songs memorized, is a sexy stag dude, is roughly the Song of Songs in modern English. Or my beloved is fawns on a hill, or sheep doing stuff. You don't necessarily know the gender of the speaker, and even if you do know the gender of the speaker, there's only one sex and gender allowed in that particular religious space because of androcentrism, because of patriarchy, because of these things that are not that I'm not advocating for. But you have this liturgical practice of recitation of the Song of Songs where you, the person speaking, is shifting between genders in the speech, in the song, and also the listener is shifting depending on the speaker. So it's this kind of mess, and you have that in any of these songs. Whenever you're reading, for instance, the Song of Miriam or the Song of Deborah, it's easiest to point out when it's women's voices in scripture, for instance, because there are not as many, and when they are there, it's really pronounced. So when, again, if we look at historically of like androcentric societies of men in particular reading these characters, there's a cross identification that's happening. There's a destabilizing of their own gender just by doing the ritual. And arguably that's also what's happening when anyone who's not a man is reading these men voices too. So we are already doing it. We're just not always doing it with any sort of the theoretical background, I would argue.
And like RuPaul says that we should name that we're doing it. Yeah.
Don't agree with RuPaul on everything, but I agree with that. Any more questions, comments, concerns, sounds?
I was thinking about that. So I'm not sure the reference that you just said about RuPaul, about naming it. I don't know what you were referring to. Sorry, I'd like to know, but
oh, it's just a quote earlier in the presentation.
Okay, I mean, I wrote a lot of notes, but it was a lot of information that you covered, and I missed the in-between session, in between the two sessions. So, but I was just curious because in thinking about what you were talking about the Song of Songs, and I was thinking about something in a more recent past, although not that recent, but thinking about how, like, for instance, I guess Shakespearean plays and different kinds of theater, where it was often that it was all men who were playing the part. And I was thinking, did they identify or feel more compassionate, or was it so distinct that element of, I mean, do we have any evidence to know if by playing the different parts, any sensitivity came from that during those time periods? Or is it necessarily that we have to consciously say, okay, we're going to learn from this experience? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm expressing myself clearly.
Totally. So that's a really great question, and there's is scholarship to argue that it was essentially misogynistic and gender essentialist or whatever, and then there's scholarship that challenges that. I'm on the side that challenges that, in particular because one of the reasons England is a great example, the Puritans and the religious were so against the theater, is because they were really worried about the behavior of the young men who would perform as women, and would that turn them into women? Would that make men more effeminate? Basically that the theater space is blurring gender. And then we can see within Shakespeare's own writing examples of that it's knowledgeable, like we know we're doing this, so there's some sense of the RuPaul quote, which is fine as long as they know it. If you have characters, women dressing up as men, dressing up as women in some of the plays or whatever, there's who are played by men in the first place, like there's some sort of theory or idea behind it. But I would say the best clue to that it was doing something is that it was a threat to quite a number of cultural powers, and was eventually made illegal and
Right.
in certain parts. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I'd love to read more about that. I mean, you really piqued my curiosity in thinking along those lines. I mean, you know, well, anyway, I'd love to talk to you more about these things. It's a fantastic presentation, and very, very interesting details. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. We are at 1. You're free to go. I'm also can stay for a little bit if you have one, if there's 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah. John, I agree. I think there's that's where the ethics comes in also, is like, do you know what you're doing? Making a conscious decision. John, did you raise your hand? Don, I mean, not John. You're next to each other on my screen.
I didn't, but I did, you know, I just recently took a survey from American Masters. Did you catch that at all? They're evidently going to do an episode on drag. And anyway, I'll forward you the email that I got from them, and but that's what I was just kind of thinking. I'll send that out to you.
Great, thanks, Don. Cool. Well, thanks folks for coming. Next week, we have an exciting guest speaker, Suzanne Roberts, talking about Afrocobra and in the 20th century, then sort of the resurfacing now with different, it's quilting, right? Cheryl, do you have more to say on that? Your mic is off. Cheryl, your mic is off.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, Bisa Butler is a young artist working in textiles and doing very large portraits in fabric and using traditional African made fabric in the style of Afrocobra that came about in the late 60s, early 70s. So yeah, she's doing some pretty amazing work.
Yeah.
I unfortunately will have to miss half of it because I get my second dose of vaccine next week. Woohoo!
Oh my gosh, Stephanie, I love that video as well. Yeah, so next week's gonna be great. Hope to see some familiar faces. Yeah, take care everyone. And you wanted to chat real quick afterwards.
Yeah, I just wanted